All right, hey everyone, we're back. And right now, I want to start thinking about another topic in today's module, one that's much different, I think, than this earlier discussion about the sort of big tent parties and how groups fit into them. Um, Instead, I want to go back to this rational approach. I know we talked a little bit at the beginning of the semester about how we could subdivide voting behavior research into a couple of different schools. One of those schools is this rational approach, which argues that we can, come at voting behavior from some very parsimonious kinds of rational choice models to determine how voters will behave. And one approach is the expected utility model, which is essentially the idea that voters are thinking about the two candidates and they're weighing the policy offerings of those candidates and trying to determine whether or not one will give them more benefits than the other. So I'm not just talking about like material benefits like tax breaks or whatever. I'm talking about like overall kind of utility. And this is again already one of the potential critiques of these kinds of rational models. What is utility and how do we measure it in reality? But also maybe one of the strengths of the flexibility of that approach is to say it could be anything, right? Whatever voters value could be utility. And so maybe for them it's some kind of social policy that they care really deeply about. Maybe it is that economic component, maybe it's something else. Voters are going to look at these two policy offerings and they're going to tally up all the things they know about them and say, okay, well, this brings me up in terms of utility a little more, this brings me down, so I'm going to favor this candidate over the other. And so one of the assumptions of this model is, well, it's got to contend with this other stuff, right? The debate surrounding partisanship. And the idea that parties essentially are made up of groups. And since we belong to groups, that's one of the reasons why we have stable partisan attachments. Expected utility models might argue, well, yeah, like we can't really, take groups into account here in these parsimonious rational choice models. But we could make the argument that partisanship is really stable because, hey, look, parties are offering the same policies. And that means that over time, your expected utility, when you're voting for these two same parties over and over, shouldn't change that much. If we had the parties flip-flopping completely and changing, their issue positions, right? Imagine, overnight, Joe Biden says, hey, we're going to take a really, really, really hardline immigration stance. Hey, we're going to, start to, I don't know what other policy issues are even on the agenda right now in the 2020 election. It's pretty much all overtaken right now by like valence, COVID and obviously like Black Lives Matter, being one of the most kind of salient pieces of a political kind of debate in modern times, right? But like the standard set of issue positions, if like Republicans and Democrats completely flipped overnight, and all of a sudden the policy platforms, they just like traded them from the two websites. That would change people's utilities, right? Democrats would look at the Democratic platform and say, that's not the party I vote for. Republicans would look at their platform and say, what is this? That's not my platform. That looks like the other guys. And they might slowly, right, figure out that their utility is better served being in the other party. And so it's really only stable, would argue this approach, not because of group attachments and the fact that groups, develop these psychological bonds. It's just because, parties are offering these policies to groups and those groups are smart and they make sense of those offerings. And so part of this rational approach model is to say that voters develop experience with those two parties, and when certain changes occur, they are able to move, right, from one to the other. But partisan stability really comes from partisans weighing the risk of supporting the other party against the expected costs and benefits of new policy. So this is also making the assumption that voters are entrenched partially because it's risky to try new things. Altogether, right, this kind of rational approach, I think we can gain something meaningful from it. I think that it's important to remember that voters are, in many respects, rational and utility maximizing when they're making decisions, and they don't want to choose, politicians that aren't going to serve their utility, based interests. But cognitive psychologists have come along and said, this might be a little simplistic. One of the most widely known critiques of this model is the cognitive resource approach, which is to say that humans are constrained by their limits in sort of their brain power. Right? They can't apply their cognitive resources to every stimulus in their environment. Even though we're very complicated processors of information, there's just so much that we can't attend to. And especially when those cognitive resources get depleted by, the sort of panoply of considerations that assault us from all, directions in the modern world. Our smartphone notifications and online content modules and all this stuff. It means that often we can make suboptimal decisions ultimately that don't do justice to our maximum utility maximization. Another corollary of this sort of theory is that humans are always trying as much as possible to preserve their cognitive resources. It's really important. It's actually a very fundamental finding in social psychology is that we don't love to expend brain energy on stuff unless we absolutely have to. And partially that goes back to our evolution, is that we're designed to protect ourselves against threats. And if that means that we've got to hold in reserve a little bit of brain power to be able to think quickly and to make decisions and snap judgments, then so be it, right? We don't like to, as humans, take our brains down to the totally drained state, right? We want to preserve those resources. And so basically we have brains that are constantly seeking to go into power save mode. And so, like, for example, if exposed to a repetitive sound, an example I have is I went to brunch one time with my wife at this restaurant downtown, and the building next door, because there's a brick wall, as most of these buildings are, on the other side, a fire alarm had gone off, but it was like a weekend, it was like a morning brunch, it was like a bank that was closed. And so on the other side, this fire alarm had gone off errantly. There was no fire, they had checked it out, but they couldn't get the system to turn off. And so this false alarm was ringing and ringing. We could hear it, pretty loud in the restaurant. Everyone could hear it. And it was very, very annoying. And eventually, though, as we were having our brunch, minutes went by, and my wife looked at me and she said, the sound stopped. And I realized we both didn't know exactly when it stopped, but it had at some point, in the middle of our meal. But it was many, many minutes had elapsed that it was off before we noticed that it was off, which is really pays testament to the fact that our brains, when there's a signal that doesn't change, we tune it out eventually. Our brains say, okay, I've processed that, I know what that is, right? And it's almost to the point where you don't even hear it anymore. It's kind of amazing if you think about it, right? The flexibility, the plasticity of our brains and our ability to filter out stuff that's not immediately relevant to what's going on around us. And so this is, again, one of the pieces of evidence in favor of this idea that we try as much as possible to preserve these scarce resources by shutting off stimuli that aren't meaningful to us. And so one of the ways that we compensate for this, one of the ways that our brains essentially are designed to go into power save mode, is they use heuristics, right, or essentially mental shortcuts that allow us to make really complicated decisions easily. Here's another aspect of our psychology that I think is really important. And that is that in addition to this idea that we're trying as hard as possible to preserve our cognitive resources, we also are trying as much as possible to preserve our self-esteem. We want to be liked. We want to feel good. We don't want to feel bad about ourselves. And so, for example, I could ask you, you can certainly respond to this in your own head, right? Why did you do so well on that test or quiz, right? What was going on there? You say that you aced, an exam for this class. I'm pretty sure, I think it's pretty likely that eventually you think to yourself, yeah, I did really well on that assignment because of me, right? I did really well because I, had the skills to get it done. I studied really hard. I did a good job. And it was down to my sheer determination. I'd like to thank the Academy, right? I did a great job on this test or quiz for this reason. But say that you did badly, right? I'll never forget, in my first year of my undergraduate, I did very, very badly on an international relations test, and it almost broke my spirit, right? Until I realized that the test was graded on a really, really steep curve, and it turns out that I had done fairly average instead of horribly. But why did I do so badly? Well, it certainly wasn't my fault. I studied really hard. I'm a good student. I'm an A student, right? Very occasionally I get an email like that. How could I do poorly? I'm an A student. Like, well, clearly this this piece of your work is evidence of the contrary, right? Why did you do badly? Well, it's certainly not your fault, right? It's some other extenuating circumstance. We try as much as possible to preserve our precious self-esteem by sort of blame shifting and taking credit for things that go well. And so this obviously is a general phenomenon, maybe even more so among narcissists than others. But this is really important when it comes to politics as well, because we often do this same self-esteem preservation sort of mental gymnastics when we're thinking about our groups as well, and particularly our politically relevant groups. And so a lot of scholars have been thinking about how this kind of works. And we've arrived kind of at this definition of what we might call a preferred world state, which is to say that partisans, especially, right, people who say that they belong to or are psychologically attached to one of the two major political parties, they construct a preferred world where their assumptions about reality are all true. And so essentially they're living in this alternate reality where their party is the good guys and the other party is the bad guys. And so what happens is, right, we try as much as possible to find information and to believe things that to be true that support that core assumption. Right? We're backfilling reality with the assumption that our guys are good and the other guys are bad. And what that means is that this is what we call a congenial partisan world. So the people in our social in-groups, they're the good guys, they're the protagonists. And the way that it comes about, right, we're not doing this consciously. We're not sitting there thinking, how can I trick myself into thinking that my guys are good and the other guys are bad? The way that this works is, of course, our brains betray us, right, with these cognitive biases. So at the end of the day, Lodge and Taper are really arriving at what they might call a dual process theory of cognition. So essentially what they're trying to argue is that it's a combination, really, of both emotion and this kind of strategic and logical reasoning that we engage in that combine to form our understanding of the world. So we are both knee-jerk, reactive, emotional, hard on our sleeve, fast thinkers, right? We think fast and we react fast to things. We make snap judgments. We use these heuristic biases that make us, judge other people very quickly. We literally judge books by their cover constantly, We use shortcuts that tap into these emotional processes all the time. But also, when this switch flips and we find ourselves peering a little bit more closely at some things, we actually are reasoners as well, and we do turn on this other process. Right? We switch tracks, right, from this one emotional-based knee-jerk process to a deliberate process that's like where we're really, really thinking carefully about something, and we're turning off our power save mode and we're ramping up our cognitive effort in investigating something. We do both of these things. Right? Emotion matters for how we make judgments. We also are very, very good reasoners when it comes down to it. And so the core of this, again, is this idea that the dual process model is happening in our brains all the time. So there's no easy answers when it comes to the psychology of voting behavior. We are both people who, especially partisans, are reacting to this preferred world congenial state. We're sort of living in a world where we are more amenable. We look more quickly and more closely at things that make our party look good and make us feel better. We also make snap judgments about people and political objects that aren't necessarily fair. But if we can get people to turn on that second layer of reasoning, in certain cases they'll do that. We also have the capability of thinking really in a sophisticated and structured way about the stimuli that we're encountering. So all told, right, this is a model that I think we're going to come back to again and again throughout the semester. This idea that the dual process model leads us into a discussion almost always of motivated reasoning. This core idea that at the end of the day, especially political partisans, but really anyone who has any kind of group loyalty or attachment in the political world is going to see the world through sort of tinted lenses, sort of bias lenses. We're all sort of biases everywhere, right? I'm not just talking about the information environment. I'm talking about the way that we encounter and process that information. So the core takeaway of this idea is, we're going to talk much more about the media later, but even if every American were exposed to the exact same news and the exact same facts about the world, we would still come to see the world in different ways. And that's because, again, some of us will grasp on to those new factual developments and tout them as evidence of our party superiority, and others will push those new facts away and say that doesn't matter. We'll find ways as motivated reasoners to explain it away and make an argument as to why it's not important. And so certainly, I'm not the first one to explain this to you. Certainly, we know that these kinds of biases and these kinds of sort of misjudgments in politics are commonplace. But hopefully, at the end of this discussion, you have a much better understanding and are more grounded in some of the theory and the psychology as to sort of why this arises. It's not just people choosing to be biased. These are our core, ultimately, sort of brain functions, in many cases, betraying us. So on that very happy note, I leave you to ponder this material for the next week. I'll see you on Wednesday, and we'll hopefully have a very robust discussion about all of this. See you later.